Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Douglas, and in this lecture I am going to introduce the biggest and most active and most, in some ways, intense debate in the field of military history, and that is the military revolution debate. Let's get started. The military revolution debate is a historical and a historiographical debate, so let me explain. The military revolution is a debate over military change that took place between roughly 1450 and 1650 in Europe. It is a historical debate because historians argue about exactly what the changes were, where those changes took place, who was involved in those changes, when did these changes start and when did these changes end. So in that sense, it's a historical debate because people are debating, what exactly constitutes elements of the military revolution and when those things took place and how significant they were. It's a historiographical debate because historians also debate whether or not it occurred, why it occurred where it did, what exactly, its consequences were and its impacts, that type of thing. Historiography is when historians debate motivations and causation. So over time, historians' opinions on why things happen the way they do changes because the attitudes and approaches of historians change. And that's called historiography. So if you ever study history at an advanced level, then you'll know you don't as much study history, you study the history of a topic. So the history of historians debating their opinions on certain things. Some of your reading in this course has actually talked about historiographical debate. So every time in your reading you've read about different historians disagreeing about motivations and causation and nature, that's really what historiography is. So the military revolution is both a historical and a historiographical debate because historians argue what the specific historical components of it were, and then they also argue whether it occurred, why it occurred, where it occurred, and what the consequences of it were. So let's break down the debate into some more specifics. To really get at the heart of the military revolution argument, first you have to remember what warfare was like in medieval Europe. So if you think back to our medieval Europe week, then you can remember and recall some elements of this because you spent an entire week learning about what medieval warfare was like, or really two if you count in crusading warfare. So think back to what medieval European warfare was like because that's where we're starting. Just as a review, remember that first, that feudal relationships were fragmenting by the time you get to 1400. Armies are starting to hire people in increasing frequency. Armies are starting to be made up of people that are being paid salaries as opposed to fighting because of some feudal obligation. By the time you get to the 1400s, there's starting to be an intense and frequent outbreak of conflict between the Catholic Church and state institutions because they're fighting over land, they're fighting over power, they're fighting over, control. And so you have, by the time you get to the early to mid 1400s, there's actually a schism that takes place where there's two popes in Europe for a while. And this isn't just political and diplomatic and religious conflict, it does break out into military conflict. So you're starting to have escalating conflict in the 1400s. The 100 Years' War had been going on since the mid-1300s, so you have this 100-year-long war, actually slightly longer than 100 years, and fighting within that 100 years was not constant. It would be probably more accurate to call the 100 Years' Wars in a way, because you definitely have these pockets of conflict and these pockets of peace. But the idea is that you have near constant warfare from 1340 into the mid-1400s. You have this religious war that's taking place as well. So there is fighting going on between the church and the state, in addition to the 100 Years' War. And then there's conflicts that start to go on within countries after the 100 Years' War ends. So there's just a lot of war all the time. Okay, that's the thing to understand. Lots of war all the time. Battle, by the time you get to the 1400s, is not necessarily an incredibly common occurrence. There's often a question, did medieval armies prefer sieges or did medieval armies prefer battles? And the answer is sort of yes. It really just depended on the situation. But commanders certainly, by the time you get to the 1400s, tend to avoid battle unless they really think that they have a shot at winning, because battle can be very costly. You lose people, you lose resources. The consequences of losing a battle can be significant. If you're a king and you lose a battle, you could lose your throne. So battle was infrequent, but it was certainly not rare. Sieges were increasingly common, but sieges weren't necessarily successful because castles were breached by the time you get to 1400. Most of the time, by 1400, if you're going to end a siege, you have to end it just by sitting outside the castle and starving the people inside out, because medieval castles by 1400 are just too complex for medieval weapons to tear down. Missile troops and missile weapons do exist. So a missile weapon, we've used this term many times in this class, a missile weapon just refers to a weapon where you're hurling something. You're hurling a missile. So missile troops were very, very common, where you're talking longbowmen or crossbowmen. There were, of course, ballistas and catapults and that type of thing, but those weren't as frequent as, let's say, longbowmen. Foot troops were common and very commonly used, but remember the core of medieval battle was the heavy cavalry soldier. The cavalry soldier that was not a commoner, but a member of an aristocratic class, or sort of a sub-aristocratic class, if we want to use that term, fought on horseback, wore chainmail or perhaps plate mail by the time you get to 1400. There is an assumption that they are from an elevated social class, and even if you have lots of men on foot, in theory they would be incapable, unless in overwhelming the cavalry in extreme numbers, would not be able to defeat a really well-organized, effectively fighting mounted heavy cavalry force. Again, sieges were common, but sieges tended to be in favor of the defender because it was very hard to have an army sit outside a castle and be able to feed itself for months at a time. So by the time you get to 1400, you have sieges that are 9 months, 10 months, 11 months, incredibly lengthy sieges because, again, assaulting the walls and tearing them down by 1400 is not something people have the capacity to do. You just have to sit outside and starve the people inside out. Ships existed, of course, in Europe, and there were naval battles in the medieval period, but the ships that medieval Europeans had access to were generally not capable of oceanic travel. They could certainly travel on oceans, but they had to stick close to coastlines, so they weren't capable of what we might call transoceanic travel. They're coastal ships, they're river ships, because they're just too small. These sailors, they can't handle deep sea weather. They can't carry enough food to transverse, deep water and long distances. So you're talking fairly, again, regional, coastal, or river naval forces. And when naval battles did occur, they always occurred in incredibly close proximity to land, if not within, easy, let's say even say swimming distance of land. So very, very close to land. You did not have naval battles where navies sort of went out into open water and fought each other. That just didn't occur. And remember, the nature of naval battles by the time you get to 1400 are basically land battles, and actually even after 1400 in the Mediterranean, as you learned about in the Ottoman week, that naval battles were just like land battles at sea. Ships would, fight, approach each other, lash ships together, and then fighting would often occur on the decks between, soldiers fighting on foot in hand-to-hand combat. So you're talking land battles at sea. So remember, this is the nature of medieval European warfare. If you fast forward to 1600, warfare looks nothing like it does in 1400, or at least very, very, very little like it does in 1400. And so military historians are trying to get at why that is. One core question that military historians have to grapple with is what constitutes a revolution. Now, in some aspects, this is a semantical argument. You know, what's a revolution? How do you define a revolution? But the problem is this is actually a really big sticking point for some people, because a lot of people have problems with the concept of a military revolution because they believe that the changes didn't occur fast enough to constitute a revolution, or the changes weren't significant enough to constitute a revolution. So the question is, what is a revolution? You know, if you have a political revolution, that's something that tends to happen in a very finite period of time. You know, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Political revolutions do not tend to be prolonged conflicts. If you want to consider the wars in Vietnam to be revolutionary wars, that's probably one of the longest you're talking. But generally speaking, revolutions, when you're talking about political revolutions, military revolutions, as in political military revolutions, not our military revolution we're talking about today, those tend to be very finite, you know, within 10 years, maybe 15 years, but even that's stretching it. If you're talking about something that's like an economic revolution, if we look at the Industrial Revolution, for example, the first and second phases of the Industrial Revolution, which sometimes are called the first and second Industrial Revolution, those happen within about 50 to 70 years. So the first Industrial Revolution gets kicked off in about 1780 and really starts to grind sort of into an economic depression era in Europe by about the 1840s. So again, you're looking at 50, 60 years, depending on when you want to pin the beginning and the end of the first phase. The second Industrial Revolution really gets kicked off, let's say, in the 1860s-ish, 1860s-ish, and ends, 18 teens, 1820s, if you really want to stretch it that far. So that's an economic revolution that takes a much longer period of time. If you're talking intellectual revolutions, if you consider the scientific revolution a revolution, which a lot of people do, that's about 250 years, gets started in the late, 1400s, and ends in the late 1600s. And then transitions into the Enlightenment, which is another intellectual revolution, but of course it's not called a revolution, that's called the Enlightenment. So that's a little bit longer. If you want to talk about the Neolithic Revolution, which is the revolution that took place when civilization emerged in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia around 10,000 BCE, that took probably about several thousand years for hunter-gatherer societies to fully transition to sedentary agricultural societies. And that's called the Neolithic, or traditionally it was called the Agricultural Revolution, but there are several agricultural revolutions, so most people now just call it the Neolithic Revolution. So the question is, are all of these revolutions? We certainly call them all revolutions. I had a professor who once said a revolution is an event that has to take place within one living person's living memory. So if you assume someone in the 17th, 18th century would be born, live, and die, but live a fairly long life and not die early of disease or violence, you're talking maybe 60 years. So does a revolution have to occur within living memory? That's certainly an argument, but then you have the Neolithic Revolution, which is several thousand years, arguably, and we call that a revolution. Now again, all of this might seem pedantic. It might seem like we're quibbling over terms, but actually a really big argument against the existence of the military revolution is that the changes that took place didn't occur fast enough for it to be a revolution. So something to keep in mind, that an aspect of this debate is just basically what physically, historically constitutes a quote-unquote revolution. The core of the military revolutionary question is this: how do you go in 1400 from this knight on the left? This is a medieval knight, and as we just talked about, remember, knights are from this noble or sort of semi-noble class. They are not commoners. They spend most of their time training for war. They ride on horseback. They wear heavy chainmail, of course, or later plate mail. They fight with pike or sword. They have this ideological code that they live by to some extent, chivalry. But again, they're from this elevated class. And although they do fight for pay, the sort of underlying motivation of the reason that they fight is they have this feudal, they owe feudal service to a lord. in exchange for titles and land and recompense of some kind. So it might not actually be physical monetary pay, but lands and titles and honor and prizes, that's pay in its own way. So how do you go from that? How do you go from the medieval knight that you have in 1400 to the soldier on the left by 1650? How do you get to that? The soldier on the right is a musketeer. He is from the lower or middle classes. He fights on foot. He's not wearing armor of any kind. He might be wearing what's called a jerkin. We'll talk about jerkins in a little bit, which is sort of this, you can see he's wearing a vest, which would have been made of thick cloth or leather as a protective, sort of as a protective vest in a way. But again, fighting on foot, using a handheld gunpowder weapon from the lower or middle class, not wearing armor, and fights for pay, specifically for a salary. So how do you go in 1400, or the debate is circa 1450, how do you go from this medieval knight on the left to 200 years later, this lower to middle class on foot musketeer that you have on the right? How do you go from the core of medieval battle being your mounted heavy cavalrymen? Remember, infantry is always there, missile troops are always there, and at times they can be very successful, but ideally in the medieval period, the most powerful soldier on the battlefield was the heavy cavalryman. So how do you go from battle where the most important soldier on the battlefield was your medieval knight to the early modern battlefield where your most important soldier was your foot musketeer or your on-foot pikeman, which is what you're seeing here. This is actually a woodcut illustration of a early modern Swiss army, and you can see that some of the soldiers have muskets and some of the soldiers have pikes. Now you can see they're all carrying swords as well, but you have this mix of pike and musket. You can see in the background that there is some cavalry, but the most important part of this army is not the cavalry. It's these lower middle class infantrymen that are, a lot of them are carrying gunpowder weapons. So how do you go from the medieval knight being the king of the medieval battlefield to the on foot lower middle class musketeer as being king of the battlefield by 1650? How do you go from your missile weapons in the medieval period being the longbow? The most effective missile weapon in the medieval period was undoubtedly the longbow. So how do you, and of course that's not a gunpowder weapon, so how do you go in 1300, 1400, the most important missile troop on the medieval battlefield in Europe being a longbowman, to 1650 having, not only handheld firearms, but enormous cannon that can fire, 2 feet in diameter cannonballs that can easily knock down medieval castle walls. So how does that transition take place? How do you have this transition from the medieval missile troop that's a longbowman carrying a non-gunpowder weapon, obviously, to what you see by 1650, which is handheld firearms and, of course, enormous cannon that can destroy medieval fortresses? How do you go from this, which is the pinnacle of medieval castle construction? This is Dover Castle, this is in England, and this is undoubtedly one of the most sophisticated medieval castles built anywhere in Europe. And you can see that it has multiple curtain walls, it has a really strong innermost curtain wall, and within that there is the keep, which was never assailed successfully in all of English history. You have 3 approaches to the castle that have incredibly steep ground that would have been very difficult to get infantry up, or certainly cavalry in mass. And what you actually can't see in this picture is that on sort of the back end of the castle, from your perspective as the viewer, which is actually the south side of the castle, that's actually literally the White Cliffs of Dover. So the one curtain wall backs up to these incredibly high, steep cliffs. So incredibly difficult to have attacked, almost impossible to have gotten to the keep, even if you had been able to get through the outer walls, which was never successfully done. So how do you go from this, which is the pinnacle of medieval castle construction, to this, which is the pinnacle of early modern fortification construction. This is what we call a star fort. We're going to talk more about the structure in a moment, but you should just see this is very different conceptually from what you're looking at in the medieval period. This was the pinnacle of early modern fortification construction. So very, very different in a lot of ways. It's mostly land, you have moats and causeways, but you're not talking about high stone walls. You don't have a huge central structure that people have to try to get to and get inside to conquer. So very, very different, but both ideal in their own time. So how do you go from that medieval ideal to this early modern ideal? How do you go from medieval ships, which is what you're seeing here on the top right? If you think back to our medieval week, this is a cog, single mast, not particularly big, would not have been capable of transoceanic travel, wouldn't have been able to carry lots of cargo. They've actually built an aft castle, so that rise on the back of the ship where you can actually see people standing. They've put an aft castle on this boat, but if this was just purely a trading ship, you'd actually take that aft castle off. If you wanted to convert this to war, you'd have that aft castle, but you'd also put a forecastle. So you'd put a rise on the front and a rise on the back that actually were meant to emulate medieval castle keeps. So how do you go from that to what you're looking at here on the bottom left? This is one of the most complex early modern sailing vessels that was ever built, and you should see multiple masts. It would have had at least 4 sails, actually 5. Could have had up to 5 sails, large sails. It also would have had smaller sails to assist with navigation. You can see that it much larger, obviously, has a much larger footprint than the medieval cog. And those holes along the sides you should recognize as gun ports. So how do you go from in 1300 even really up to 1350, actually arguably even until the late 1300s? How is your medieval European ship look like that? But then by 1650 or 1700, your ideal ship looks like what you're seeing on the bottom left. So that's a question. How do you go from what you're seeing on the top right to what you're seeing on the bottom left? That is what military historians are trying to figure out. How do you go from what you see in 1450 to what you see in 1650? Specifically, the definition of the military revolution is this. The military revolution occurred between circa 1450 and circa 1650 and involved innovations in military tactics, technology, drill, fortifications, and doctrine that led to a need for more trained troops and less for permanent standing armies. So that's the first part of the military revolution, is that you're talking about a massive change in everything about European warfare. Who was fighting, why they were fighting, how they fought, what they fought with, how big the armies were, the presence of gunpowder weapons, the change to vessels. And what proponents of the military revolution are saying is that some type of huge series of changes had to occur between about 1450 and about 1650 to go from what we saw in the medieval world to what we see in the early modern world. And then this is what makes the military revolution so important, because if this just was about changes to military affairs, that would be one thing. But what makes the military revolution such an important debate for historians is that historians argue that the need and demand for military change had wider social, political, economic, cultural, and religious implications. Specifically, these changes had major political consequences. Administrative complexity increased, states began centralizing, the supply of specie, which is what we call like hard cash money, increased, and new financial practices emerged to support this massive growth. In other words, the emergence of a more modern form of war created the modern European state. So this is, again, what makes the military revolution so significant, is military historians who support the military revolution say that a monumental series of changes occurred in warfare between 1450 and 1650, and these military changes led to enormous change to the political, social, cultural, economic, and even religious practices throughout all of Europe. And it is that change, that feedback loop that's created, because once you had political change, it fed back into military change. and which fed right back into political and economic and social and cultural and religious change. And so you create this feedback loop. And that feedback loop is what military historians call the military revolution. The military revolution had to occur in phases or in steps. So let's break down what each of these steps was so that you can get from where we start, which is the medieval way of fighting, to our end, which is the early modern way of fighting. The first step has to be dismounting the knight, because remember, the king, quote unquote, of medieval battle was the mounted cavalryman, this aristocrat or sub-aristocrat fighting on horseback in chainmail. You have to figure out a way to beat him, okay? You have to beat that soldier to start introducing change. And the way that that starts to happen is with the rise of effectiveness of missile weapons. So the longbow, although it was certainly used in the 13th century, doesn't really come into its own until the 14th century. And this is why we see in 14th century battles medieval cavalry increasingly being, defeated. They're become less and less effective when facing really well organized, on-foot missile troops. The Battle of Agincourt is often seen as a paramount, paragon example of this, where you have this stereotypical French heavy cavalry army that's been raised by the French king, organized through sort of semi-feudal relationships and some sort of hired pay, sort of a combination of both. But, the Battle of Agincourt, from the French perspective, looked very similar to a battle you would have seen in Europe in 1200. You have people on foot, you have missile troops, but the most important part of the French army at Agincourt is your mounted cavalry. But the English are fighting mostly on foot, and a huge contingent of their soldiers are longbowmen. And what the outcome of the battle is that you have the mass death of French knights at the hands of longbow fire. So here you have this battle in 1415, where now the medieval heavy cavalryman, the knight, has literally been dismounted and figuratively dismounted as the most important aspect of medieval battle, because longbows could penetrate chainmail. European knights adopt plate mail in the late medieval period to try to combat missile weapons, longbow fire and crossbow fire specifically. It works sometimes, but not necessarily overwhelmingly effectively, and it really is missile troops that start the beginning of the end for the medieval knight. The result is what some historians, and I know this is going to make it confusing because we're using the word revolution again, but it begins a sort of sub-movement of the greater military revolution that some people call the infantry revolution, which is where you have the emergence in the 14th century of on-foot troops that can fight better or are more superior than your cavalry. And there's actually an entire book that's written about this that just focuses on how you start to have these battles that occur in the 14th century, where missile troops and soldiers on foot are increasingly effective and increasingly easily defeat your mounted heavy cavalry. And so this is how you dismount the knight, is you have the rise in the supremacy of infantry on the medieval battlefield that we really see get going in the 1300s and of course only accelerates in the 1400s. What this leads to by the early modern era is that you have incredibly large infantry armies that consist, as I mentioned earlier, of lower to middle class foot soldiers that fight with pikes or fight with muskets. They fight in formations like you're seeing here on the bottom, where what you're seeing here is these are tercios. So at the center of these formations you have pike soldiers, and then they're actually surrounded by musketeers. So it's this combination of pike and musket, and you can actually see in this wood etching here on the bottom left, they're actually besieging a star fort, and we'll get into what the specifics of star forts in a moment, but you just saw one a minute ago. But because you start to dismount the knight with missile weapons. And because you have this infantry revolution, where infantry starts to become far more important on the medieval battlefield than cavalry, then what this cavalry charge, remember it's called a care, this cavalry charge, which was sort of the culmination of medieval battle, it was the core tactic of medieval cavalrymen, this coordinated large charge toward the enemy. You have the replacement of the care with on-foot infantry tactics and increasingly sophisticated infantry formations made up of these soldiers that we've talked about. The second step of the revolution, and the one that some historians argue is actually the most important, is the introduction and evolution of gunpowder weapons in Europe. Gunpowder weapons, so some historians argue, really are what changed fundamentally the face of European warfare. They're the catalyst, as it were, the fuel, shall we say, of the military revolution. As we discussed in previous weeks, gunpowder was developed in China and gradually made its way west, either along the Silk Route or perhaps because the Mongols adopted it from the Chinese, and then military forces that faced the Mongols adopted it after interacting with them. Perhaps crusaders brought it back to the West after, being involved and being present in the Near East and interacting with people that were using it there. We don't actually know exactly how it got to Europe, but the fact is that it did get to Europe. And once Europeans started to adopt it and alter it, it had, as I said, a profound effect upon warfare. Gunpowder is made of sulfur charcoal and potassium nitrate, and most of it is potassium nitrate with 10% sulfur and 15% charcoal. And Europeans, once they got gunpowder, had it in its proper percentages roughly, although the sort of transmission of that knowledge was not particularly effective all the time. So at first, gunpowder weapons in Europe are not particularly effective. We think that they got to Europe around 1290. By 1346, we have the first land battle where gunpowder weapons were used, and according to the chronicler of the battle, the gunpowder weapons, all they did was scare the horses. This is the Battle of Crécy in 1346, which some historians, as I said, think is the first battle where Europeans used gunpowder weapons on the battlefield, but they didn't have much effect. So gunpowder, we know, is in Europe by about the 1290s, but by 1350 they haven't really done too awfully much with it. It's only in the late 1300s and into the 1400s that Europeans really start engaging with gunpowder, developing gunpowder, increasing its efficiency, increasing the sophistication of the weapons that they're using it with, and this is what has the monumental impact upon war. One of the biggest innovations that Europeans actually introduce, which might come as some surprise, is just the use of water. And specifically what Europeans figure out is something called corning, which is what you're seeing here. One of the things that made gunpowder ineffective early on, whoever used it actually, was that when it's in its powder form, it's not necessarily particularly explosive, because if all of the components have been ground into a powder and then just mix the powder together, if you were to light it, expose it to fire, you would certainly have some type of combustible event, but it's not going to be incredibly enormous. And that's because even in its powder form, the contents are not going to be in incredibly close proximity. So you're going to have some combustive power, but it's not going to be so much that you're going to be able to just pour loose gunpowder into a barrel, for example, and then hurl a projectile hundreds of yards, into an enemy fortress and knock it down, for example. It's not going to be strong enough to do that. So what Europeans actually figure out once they start really engaging with gunpowder is they start developing something called corning, which is where you add a liquid to, usually it's just water, you add a liquid to gunpowder and you make it, first they would make it into these little pellets, which is what you're seeing here on the bottom left. Or once you start to get into the early modern era, they actually start to make it into what they called loaves, and they literally would at times look like bread loaves, and that's what you're seeing here on the top right. This person has corned this gunpowder, so they've just added water and they roll it into a ball. Now you might say if you add water it's not going to work. Well, all you have to do is let it dry. And what you have is, because you've added the water and you've packed the components of the gunpowder in much closer proximity to, one another, and you have either these pellets, or you have, again, they would call them loaves, and they often, you don't see that here in this diagram, but they would at times store it in loaves that looked very much like bread loaves. Because you have that and the components are in much closer proximity, they're packed tighter together, then your combustive power is greater. So whenever you see in movies where people are just have actual sort of raw gunpowder, and it is actually a powder, that's not what people used once gunpowder was actually being used widely and it was effective. They would have small pellets or medium-sized pellets like you're seeing here on the bottom left, or they would have these big loaves that they would crush, or then, grind into sort of smaller pieces that then they would put into gunpowder weapons. And really, until the advent of smokeless powder in the 19th century, gunpowder does not change. Once Europeans refined their use of it in the 1300s and introduced corning, gunpowder doesn't change for 500 years. So these two things are very effective, but of course when you have your combustion event in a cannon or in a handheld firearm, it creates lots of smoke. So you start to have early modern, late medieval, and then early modern battlefields that are, you don't just have the metaphorical fog of war that Clausewitz was talking about, it is a literal fog of war. But because of this combustive power, because Europeans really start harnessing it, they start developing gunpowder weapons to handle the combustion of the gunpowder itself, and that is what has this enormous impact upon the battlefield. Here you see the first depiction of a cannon in Europe on the top left. This is actually from a coronation book. So when kings were crowned, a lot of times they would be presented with gifts. And Edward III, who was the King of England and crowned king in 1327, when he was crowned king, he was given a coronation book. And one of the illustrations in that coronation book, we think, is actually the first medieval illustration of a cannon. And that's what you're seeing here. You can see that the person lighting the cannon has a touch rod. You can see that they're touching the cannon. There's some type of spark that's being created, and then a projectile is being fired out of the front end. The thing that's being fired that you should notice is actually just a large bolt. So it's not firing a cannonball, quote unquote, quite yet. So the earliest use of gunpowder weapons, we think, in Europe were just sort of fit into pre-existing technologies in a way, because they're just using it to fire bolts. But of course, once they start to adopt it, with more frequency and start to really invest time and energy into developing better and better gunpowder weapons, things really do start to change. We know that the first land battle that I just mentioned a moment ago, where we see gunpowder weapons used, was the Battle of Crécy, which is in 1346. Although cannon were used in the battle, they weren't really effective. They're actually first used in a siege in late 1346 and 1347 at the Siege of Calais, which actually the English win the Battle of Crécy against the French in 1346, and then they start engaging in a siege of the city of Calais just a month after this, and the siege lasts 11 months, and they actually do try to use cannon at the siege as well. Not against the city itself. They actually try to fire cannon at the ships that are bringing supplies into the city to keep the city alive, and they can't hit the ships at about 50 yards. We think the ships were about 50 yards from the shore, this little inlet into Calais, and the cannon are on the beach at most 50 yards from these ships, and they can't hit them. So they couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. They really didn't have an effect on the medieval battlefield initially, but they are present, we know. The first naval battle where cannon was used was actually the Battle of Armuiden, which is what you're seeing here on the bottom center. This was a battle between the English and, again, the French. Also a conflict of the 100 Years' War, and so that's why the 100 Years' War is important, because you have this constant warfare, and because the need to continually wage war is there, people are developing better and better ways to fight, at least in theory. So, the English are the ones that really first adopt gunpowder weapons and start to try to make them more effective. But, you know, in both this first instance of a land battle and a naval battle and the siege, as I just said, although they are there, initially in the 14th century, they are not particularly effective. Gunpowder weapons are getting better and better, though. As the decades pass, Europeans get better at making the, gunpowder weapons. They get better at making gunpowder itself, so that by the time you get to the mid-1400s, Europeans create relatively effective handheld firearms. The very earliest useful, shall we say, handheld firearm that we know about was a weapon called the arquebus. Sometimes you'll see it called the harquebus, starting with an H, but it's essentially the same weapon, and you're looking at more advanced examples of them here. What you should notice, very long, very thick. The soldier, the musketeer firing the arquebus, the gun is so long and so heavy that they had to fire it on a stand. You can see he's actually holding the stand in one hand and he's firing with the other. You can see that a lot of smoke is being produced by the weapon. And the way that the weapon was fired was actually with a wick, with a fuse. And you can see that's the rope that seems to be sticking down out of the weapon. And if you look particularly, you can really see it in the middle arquebus on the top. You can see that little loop there. That is the wick, or the fuse. So what you would do is you would you would put the projectile in the barrel of the gun and you would ram it down with a ramrod. Then you had a touch pan and you would pour gunpowder onto that, and then you would light the end of your fuse, and when you pulled the trigger of the gun, then the lit fuse would flip down, hit the flash pan, ignite the gunpowder in the barrel, and fire the weapon. The experienced musketeer in Europe could fire maybe 2 to 3 times a minute if they were really, really, really experienced with the weapon. The sort of core advantage of these weapons was not accuracy. They were not particularly accurate. If you had a single musketeer who got used to firing that specific weapon, one specific weapon, and got really used to firing it, then that individual could become somewhat adept at hitting targets at distance, roughly. We have scant accounts of musketeers, mostly garrison troops, people that guarded fortifications, who would spend their downtime training. They would get really used to firing their one specific weapon. And we have, again, scant accounts of people hitting targets at distance in those instances. But for the most part, the emphasis with these weapons was absolutely not accuracy. It was volume. It was brunt force. So you wanted to have lots of musketeers that could fire all of these muskets at one time, and again, sort of, constitute a blunt force rather than a precision one. Arquebuses very quickly develop into what we more readily would call a musket. And you can actually see this is a musket very close up. You can see the fuse there, and you can see the touch pan. And these guns were intermittently effective. I'll use that phrase. The problem is they were, again, they're not very accurate. They're very heavy. They are very, very susceptible to inclement weather. So obviously, because you have powdered gunpowder that's exposed to the air, you have to light a wick, which is also exposed to the air. Armies aren't going to be able to keep their weapons from getting wet if it rains. And so these guns were very, very susceptible to wet, inclement weather. If you can't light your gunpowder, if you can't light your wick, you're not firing your weapon. You also have this trend where they make the barrels incredibly long, because the thinking was the longer you make the barrel, the more accurate the shot is going to be, which is not necessarily the case. But you'll actually see, even into the 1700s, you'll see matchlocks and flintlock muskets that are 6 feet long, because the idea, they think, is that if you make the barrel longer, it makes the projectile more effective. It doesn't necessarily. Really, again, it's about brute force. By the time you get to the mid to late 1500s, these matchlocks, which is what they're called, it's a matchlock, just light a match, is sort of an allusion to that, are replaced with something called a flintlock, which are a little bit better in inclement weather because instead of having a wick, you actually have a flint that is there. And when you fire, when you pull the trigger, the flint on the trigger slams down onto this touchpad, and that's what creates a spark. It ignites the gunpowder. Again, because you're dealing with flint and you're not dealing with a wick, it is a little bit better in inclement weather. They're a little bit better made, but matchlocks and flintlocks are really the pinnacle of handheld gunpowder weapons during the military revolution. Here you can see what a flintlock looks like. You can see again, the long barrel, and you can see the flint mechanism here in the bottom left picture. So you can see that you have the hammer, you have the flint that's attached to the hammer, and the idea is you have this frizzen that sits vertical. And when you pull the trigger, then the flint whips down, hits the frizzen, creates a spark. That spark goes into the pan, which what you should notice is the pan is also covered now, which helps the gunpowder that you've poured in the pan, and that creates the spark, and that's what fires the weapon. Again, reload time, a really experienced flintlock musketeer, maybe 3 times a minute. So not particularly accurate, fairly slow to reload. The emphasis was on mass, but of course the key thing is that they're much better than not having one at all. Cannon go through an interesting evolution, shall we say, during the 1400s into the 1500s. The earliest phase of the military revolution was all about going big or going home, so to speak. You want to start making bigger and bigger cannon. What you're seeing here is the earliest style of cannon at the beginning of the military revolution. You should notice that, these are made of iron. They are not particularly big. They would have been very heavy, but they're not particularly big. And one defining feature that you should notice is the bands around the barrel. Those are not for aesthetics. That's not because it looks good. That's because those are there to fortify the barrel. Because the iron that people used in Europe in the 1400s was not purified enough to be able to withstand a lot of pressure, right? Because what you're doing is you're containing an explosion, you're containing a combustion event. So you have to be able to have iron that can withstand that. And usually iron barrels themselves were not capable of doing that if you want to fire your weapon repeatedly. So early on, they would wrap these iron bands around the barrel in an effort to, again, keep the barrel intact. But not particularly big, would have been maybe 3 to 4 feet in length, would have been quite heavy, but most of the time would not have been about attacking fortifications. They were anti-personnel weapons. That's what the earliest cannon are. It's not about fortifications. It's not about knocking down structures. The earliest gunpowder weapons were used against enemy soldiers. But very quickly, people get obsessed with making bigger and bigger and bigger pieces of artillery. Europeans do this, the Ottomans do this in a really big way, making these enormous bombards that have these enormous projectiles. But as we discussed in the Ottoman week, the problem with making guns this big, for anybody that did it, is that they were incredibly heavy, they were hard to move, they cracked a lot, even if they were made of bronze, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. The English, for example, once they conquered the city of Calais in 1347, in the early 1400s, they spent a lot of money and a lot of time casting this enormous cannon that wouldn't have been quite as big as this bombard, but would have been pretty big for the time. They spend all this time casting this big cannon. They give it a name. Soldiers like to name their cannon. That was very important to them. And the first time they fire it, it cracks. And they just have to bury it in the sand because Calais is on the shore. They bury it in the sand. So they want to make these enormous guns because at first they're sort of obsessed with this idea that the bigger your artillery piece, the better it's going to be. But they don't really realize, at least initially, that there's a lot of utility to having smaller pieces of artillery instead of these enormous pieces that are, again, they're big, they're heavy, they're hard to move, they're hard to use. You can't use them repetitively like you would want to because the barrel gets too hot and then it'll crack or it will warp. And so, you know, in this case, you don't just want the biggest gun you can possibly produce because practicality really has to win out. This is why, once you get to the 1500s and 1600s, Europeans start to produce what we might call more realistic cannon. So this is what you're seeing here. These are cannon that were produced in the 1500s or early 1600s. You can see that this cannon on the top right, this is one of the earliest guns produced in the late 1400s. It's bigger, but it still has the bands around it. But again, it's, you know, sort of a more realistic size, easier to put on these carriages, easier to transport. And in the late 1400s and early 1500s and into the 1500s, centralized states start working more with bronze because they realize that despite bronze's extreme cost, they realize that it's just the most durable metal that they can produce that's going to be able to withstand the high temperatures and the repetitive use. So all of the guns that you're seeing here, or at least except for the one on the bottom left, you know, top left, top right, bottom right, all of these are made of bronze. They might not look like bronze, but they actually are bronze with different mixtures. People experimented with different mixtures of the bronze, you know, the copper and the tin, how much of each to put in. Some even sometimes mixed in iron to try to fortify it, but usually they tried to stick to bronze more purely. But you know, you can see this gun here on the top right is the earliest. This is a mid to late 1400s gun, and then the gun here on the bottom left and the top right, these are 1500s. So you see that the bores are getting smoother, they're getting better at casting them. They're not getting, you know, this one on the bottom right is quite large, but it's not so enormous that it would be impossible to move around and to wield, and so it's more practical. Some Europeans also experimented with brass. This is actually a brass cannon that you're seeing here on the bottom left, but they were not particularly popular. Brass was cheaper, but it was also easier, more prone to breaking and cracking, so it wasn't particularly resilient. So really the ideal material for cannon making was bronze. What these gunpowder weapons lead to in the 1400s into the 1500s, because cannon, again, initially they just used them against enemy troops because they're just, you know, they're not very effective, they're not powerful enough to knock down fortresses. But once you start to get to the mid 1400s and late 1400s, then the cannon are getting big enough and powerful enough to knock down medieval fortresses. You know, Ottoman bombards have a lot of weaknesses, but if they were used ideally, they easily knock down enemy forces. And in fact, Ottoman cannon do. Europeans don't produce big bombards like the Ottomans do, but they start producing cannon that is big enough and effective enough to start knocking down these medieval fortresses. Because think back, and you're seeing this is actually a depiction of the Siege of Orleans in the early 1400s, and this is one of the first sieges that we know about where gunpowder weapons were actually used against a fortification instead of just being used against enemy troops. And you can see the gun, it's on wooden carriage, and you can see the bands. You can see the bands around the barrel. Think to medieval castle structure. The walls are made of stone, they're very, very high. They would have been thick, but they would not have been able to stand up to, you know, a cannonball that is a foot in diameter. Certainly not a cannonball that's 2 feet in diameter. So what you start to have in the late 1400s is you start to have the increasing death of the medieval fortress. Specifically, it's not that people stop constructing fortresses, it's just that they realize that what they construct has to change, because cannon are so effective by the time you get to the late 1400s that the way of building a castle in the medieval period, it doesn't work anymore because it's easy to knock down. You know, if you build a castle in 1500 that's like Dover, and you have an enemy that can get artillery within sight of the walls, that castle's coming down. It's not going to be able to stand. The thing that saves Vienna in the Siege of Vienna is really not the walls. It's that the Ottomans can't get their bombards in close proximity to the walls. So it's not the fortress's construction itself necessarily, although it was a very well constructed fortress and did suffer damage, but the Ottomans weren't able to fire fast enough or close enough to be able to knock the walls down. If they had gotten those bombards in close proximity to the city, Vienna would have easily fallen. Easily fallen. But people still want fortresses. People still want fortifications. So when you start to have the death of the medieval fortress in the mid to late 1400s, Europeans have to find an alternative. To find a solution to this problem, Europeans start to turn to rising trends in humanism and rationalism. So the Renaissance was an intellectual movement that took place in the late medieval era, mostly in Italy, but of course it spread to other parts of Europe. And humanism was all about a belief in the individual and a belief that the individual can be improved and perfected through knowledge and engagement. Rationalism was this idea that, you should watch things and observe things and then come to conclusions based upon your observations. And humanism and rationalism are seen as the precursors to the scientific revolution, by the way. So in the 1400s and into the 1500s, the scientific revolution also kicks off, which again was fed by the Renaissance. So the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, you've got all these new scientific ideas that are being developed in mathematics and physics and, astrology and astronomy and chemistry. And people understand that the medieval structure is not working anymore, so they try to find a solution. And so what they do is they apply rationalism and mathematics to the construction of fortresses. And what they come up with is a structure that is often just called a star fort. And you're seeing diagrams of them here. And so the first question is, why are they built this way? Well, they're built this way because they are trying to eliminate what we call defilade. And defilade is dead space. So if you are trying to attack an enemy position and you're somewhere where you are shielded from visual sight of that enemy position, you're in defilade effectively. So what you want to do is you want to reduce around a fortification defilade or dead space, where someone standing on a wall of that fortification can't see a person attacking the fortification. And so what they do is they apply careful mathematics to the structure of the fortification. So what you're seeing here with each of these, points of the star is you're seeing carefully mathematically calculated construction that is meant to eliminate dead space. And the idea is that you're going to place cannon around this fortress on all of these points and along all of these walls, so that no matter where an enemy approaches this fortification, they are going to be within visual distance and visual sight of the defenders, and more importantly within firing distance and firing sight of the defenders. So you're taking mathematical principles, you're creating this incredibly complex structure that eliminates the ability of an enemy army to easily approach the walls, get a cannon within close proximity of the walls, and knock the walls down. Because an army is going to be under fire, ideally, if it's constructed right. An enemy, as they approach, is going to be under fire the entire time they're within range of the defender's guns. That's going to make it impossible for someone to set up a position outside the walls, set up their artillery, and then fire at your walls and knock them down. There are incredibly complex and detailed manuals that are created in the 1500s, late 1400s and into the 1500s, that detailed exactly how to structure these fortifications, exactly how the math should work out, exactly how they should be built, exactly how sort of the outer, central, and inner layers should be constructed and should interact, where the entrances should be placed, because in addition to using, geometry and mathematics to construct this fortress that has no, again, no defilade around it, that is going to make it impossible for someone to get in close proximity of your walls without you knowing that they're there. But they also create a very complex system of sort of inner and outer walls and causeways between the inner and outer layers that also make it, if someone does get within proximity of your walls. You know, you run out of gunpowder, or you know, your guns break or whatever it might be, or you don't have a lot of artillery enough to, you know, completely protect every avenue of approach. Then you also have very much sort of like an inner and outer keep system. You have these multiple lines of defense as someone approaches that is going to make it incredibly, incredibly difficult to get to the center of the structure. The result is, as I said, what we call a star fort, and these are 3 surviving examples of star forts in Europe. If you actually want to visit a star fort, then you can actually go to Fort Ticonderoga in New York. So if you're ever in upstate New York, then I recommend you visit Fort Ticonderoga. That is actually a star fort that is very well maintained and is in upstate New York. So you can go to it, you can walk around it. It's not 100% as it was when it was a real fortification in the 1700s, but that's what one is. So if you want to go see one and you don't want to go to Europe to see it, you can always go to Fort Ticonderoga. But what you should notice here, of course, first is this star configuration, the outer and inner layers of defense. All of these star forts use water moats, so that is water that you're seeing around all of them. So you're obviously not going to be able to get, you know, cannon through those moats because they would have been very deep. And the star fort moat uses the same premise as a medieval fortification moat. You know, these wouldn't have been pristine bodies of water. They wouldn't have been filled with dangerous animals of any kind, certainly. But the water would have been where people dumped their waste, where people dumped their trash. These wouldn't have been clean bodies of water, so you certainly wouldn't have wanted to swim through them if you could avoid it. And the idea is that you're not going to be able, unless you can cross these very, very, very narrow causeways that you can see if you look very careful, that, you know, is allowing someone to get from an outer layer to an inner layer. Unless you can get across those, which would have been drawbridges, so in a defensive situation those would have been raised, unless you're going to create some type of boat that's going to get you across the causeway. And keep in mind too, the 2 pictures on the bottom left and top right have trees that are around these forts. Those trees would not have been there in the early modern era. There would have been completely clear line of sight in all directions. This is just a modern decoration. So eliminate the trees. It would have been completely open, much like you're seeing in most directions on the bottom right picture. So completely open line of sight. The idea that someone would be able to get close enough to, you know, take barges across these moats would have been very, very difficult if the fortification had enough gunpowder, and, you know, getting the bridges down would have been a very difficult prospect as well, because you're always going to be within range of the fire of the defenders. The next thing that I haven't mentioned yet that you might have noticed, even if you didn't realize you noticed it, was notice that you're not dealing with a lot of stone here. Now, if you look very carefully at the top right picture, most of the stone on the bottom fortifications has been removed. There is stone that's used in the star fort, but what you should notice that they're using far more often is dirt. They're just using earth, because guess what? The best way to stop enemy gunfire, enemy artillery fire, it's dirt. The best type of wall to build, a dirt wall. You're not going to be able to easily penetrate dirt with early modern artillery, or certainly not early modern muskets. So what they would do is they would often line dirt with stone, which again I said you can sort of see that on the top right picture. You can see some walls where you have the dirt, but then it's been lined with stone. And that's certainly what you would have seen with these structures in the early modern era, that they would have been lined with stone. This is why if you go to Fort Ticonderoga, you can actually still see this, that some of the walls are still lined with stone. But behind the stone is dirt. And the emphasis is not on height here, because they don't need height. You don't actually want height, because you don't want this big, you know, walled only stone structure that medieval cannon are going to knock down. You want to use earth, you want to use dirt, you might line it with stone, but that's as much an aesthetic choice as anything else. So you're not going to have huge elevated targets for attacking cannon to hit. The final thing you should really notice is that there's not necessarily enormous, again, not enormous tall fortifications at the center. these star forts didn't have keeps per se. So they would have had sort of a central stone complex, and you can see that very much on the top right, where you can see sort of that central stone border a little bit. But really, they weren't constructed to be, to have this central keep. The idea was that the outer defenses were so strong that you didn't really need that sort of central keep structure. So although some star forts did have sort of a stone building that would have been fortified, the underlying concept of the star fort is that you don't really need that. That the defense itself, and remember, each point, there's no cannon obviously in these pictures, but at each point, every time that you had a point, or in each of the depresses of each of the points of the star, you had cannon. So there would have been cannon all over this thing. And the idea is they're pointing in every single direction, and sort of think of a porcupine in effect. Every single direction, every potential line of approach, you're going to be within sight of a cannon as soon, within the range of that cannon. So you're talking, quite a long distance, that if an enemy army is approaching, they're going to be within, whenever the army is within visual sight of the fortification, within range of the cannon, they're going to be fired on by that cannon, and so they're not going to even be able to get close to it. And this is actually what made star forts so deadly. And so military historians argue, how do you defeat this thing? If it is so defensible, how do you defeat it? Well, the way to defeat it is to starve it out. So this is what some historians argue led to the emergence of enormous armies in the early modern era. In the medieval period, your army at most 10,000. The army that the English take into France in 1346 ultimately will have 30,000 soldiers in it. That was enormous for the medieval period. 30,000 was large. On average, a big army in the medieval period would have been about 10,000 strong. But by the time you get to 1650, armies are 100,000, 200,000, and that's because you would have to have a big army that you can completely surround these things with a really good defense, and you just have to sit there, out of range of their cannon fire, and just wait them out. So the, proponents of the military revolution argue that you've got these, you dismount the knight with missile troops. Then you have the introduction of gunpowder weapons. Gunpowder weapons change the nature of land warfare because you have muskets, and they change the nature of sieges because you have these, the destruction of the medieval castle. The medieval castle is replaced with a star fort, and then the only way to defeat a star fort is with this really, really big army. So you start to have the explosion in army size because of the sheer sophistication, intricacy, and effective defensive nature of the star fort. Another element of the military revolution that's actually often forgotten by a lot of military revolution historians who focus on land warfare is that you also have stuff going on the water, and you can't forget that. So remember that you've got the medieval cog, and it's a single-mast ship that could sail in oceans, but really had to stick to coastlines. You're not capable of transoceanic voyages. But what we start to see in the mid to late it really starts in the late 1300s, but you have mid to late 1400s, you start to have ships getting bigger and bigger. They add multiple masts, and they become more complex through what we call rigging systems. So if you look at these vessels, all of those ropes that you see, that's rigging. And the use and utility of rigging is that it allows fewer people to operate bigger and bigger ships. So, in the medieval period, if you had a vessel that was as big as the one you're seeing here, but it would have had a single mast. But let's just pretend you have a medieval cog that's the size of the ship here on the left, but it's a single mast. I mean, you're talking 40 to 50 people to operate a vessel like that, and you can see that it's bigger than that picture of the medieval cog I showed you, but it's not enormous, and people have to eat. So you're not going to be able to travel for several months across an open ocean because the ship's just not big enough to carry enough food to feed that many people for that period of time. But if you add multiple masts, then the ship is more navigable, it's more maneuverable, and it's easier to navigate and move It can actually also move faster. The more sails you have, you can move faster. If you also add these with more masts and more sails, you need more rope, which is rigging. But the benefit of all the rigging is that you're using pulleys and you're using physics principles to allow fewer people to operate these bigger vessels. So this ship, maybe a crew of 30, could have easily operated with a crew of 30. So that's 20 less people that you have to feed. And that means the ships can get bigger. They can get bigger. As they get bigger, they add more masts, they add more rigging, it becomes more complex. And this is why in a lot of countries, sort of the most egalitarian command structures were navies, because you can't just, you can't just take someone and plonk them on a ship and expect them to be able to operate it. No, you have to learn how to operate ships. If I asked one of you to go operate a sailing ship right now, unless you had previous experience, you're probably not going to have any idea of how to do it. Pure sailing ship. No offense, I wouldn't either. So you have to be able to train, you have to be trained, you have to know how to operate these systems. So it becomes very specialized, which is why navies in the early modern era are often the most egalitarian, because really the only way for you to succeed and move up in rank is that you're really good at it. So this is why you have a lot of social mobility in early modern navies. But the salient point here is that ships are getting bigger, the rigging systems are becoming more complex, they're adding more sails, and they're also adding artillery. So they're also starting to add gunpowder weapons to these boats. Now, we think of gunpowder weapons as being mounted on the side of boats. That ship that I showed you, the Man of War from the early modern era, of course all the gun ports were on the sides. If you've ever seen a movie like Pirates of the Caribbean, for example, then we also always think of guns being mounted on the sides of sailing boats. But actually at first they were mounted on the front. They would have been mounted right on the front of the boat and would have been fired from the front. But the ships are getting bigger, they've got multiple sails, they can move faster, they're more navigable. Because they're bigger and crews are smaller, then they can travel longer distances without needing to stop, which means they're increasingly capable of transoceanic travel. The fact that the ship is bigger and more navigable helps with that too. And they're also able to defend themselves more readily and in different ways with artillery. Now you don't have to get close and, board the enemy ship and fight hand-to-hand, although actually that does happen into the early modern era. They can do that, but they can also try to fight each other at a distance, increasingly with gunpowder weapons. As soon as Europeans figured out that it was more effective to mount gunpowder weapons on the sides of their vessels instead of the front, a front-mounted gun would have looked very much like you're seeing here on the bottom right, made of iron. The bands around the barrel, would have been loaded at the breech, and again would have been mounted right on the front. But by the time you get to 1500, Europeans figure out mounting guns on the sides of ships makes more sense. And as I said, the earliest ones are called swivel guns, and that's because they could be moved around and swiveled to aim, wherever your attacker was approaching from. Fairly small, fairly light as far as cannon go. The projectiles would have been, no bigger than, let's say, a golf ball size to maybe a baseball size. So not particularly large, but, they had to be lighter. They had to be more maneuverable because they're on ships. You can't weigh the ship down too much. But this is, in the mid to late 1400s, this is what you're looking at, these side-mounted swivel guns. By the mid-1500s, this is the ideal. This is actually a specific ship. This is called the Mary Rose, and this is an illustration of it here on the bottom left. This is it after it has been salvaged here on the right. And this is literally the Marie Rose. It sunk in 1545, and the British always knew where it was, and they actually brought it up from the bottom of the ocean. And it might look like it's still in water, but you're actually seeing the room that it's stored in. It's stored in low light to prevent light from damaging it too much, and they actually pump smoke into the room partially as a preserving agent, but also to sort of mimic water. So this actually is a room above water. It's not in water anymore, but that's it. So you can see it had multiple levels, and you can see from the illustration, looks like sort of your stereotypical early modern sailing vessel big forecastle, big aft castle, lots of masts, lots of sails, you've got lots of gun ports, and these cannon that you're looking at here on the top left, these are actually cannon from the Marie Rose that they brought up before they brought the whole ship up. You can see they're very, very large. So, swivel guns is what you were looking at in the mid to late 1400s. Then by 1550, this is what you're looking at. Much bigger, huge guns would have fired maybe 10 to 15 pound cannonballs. They're actually made of iron. By the time you get to the mid 1500s, Europeans figure out how to make an iron that's good enough that they don't have to use expensive bronze anymore. So they're made of iron. And you can see, based upon the people standing in front of them, just how big they were. And the Marie Rose actually sunk due to a navigation and a sort of command error, so it actually wasn't sunk by an enemy, so it was intact when it went down, and so they were able to salvage it. The fascinating thing about the Marie Rose as well is that King Henry VIII understood that gunpowder weapons were important and certainly believed that keeping up with technological development was important, but he also still really believed in the power of the longbow. So we actually know a lot about medieval longbows because also found in the Marie Rose were longbows. So they brought them up because we don't have surviving longbows from the medieval period. No longbows made in the medieval period have survived. The earliest ones we have are actually the ones that were salvaged from the Marie Rose. So you're looking at really rapid development here from what you looked at in the 1400s with the swivel guns to those vessels I showed you that would have been for mid to late 1400s technology. This is mid 1500s technology. And of course this, you've already seen this picture, this is the pinnacle of the military revolution, or perhaps in a way the result of it. This is a military vessel by the mid 1700s. So you're talking enormous ship, much bigger than anything that would have ever been, possible to build in the medieval period. You have lots and lots of gun ports, lots and lots of cannon pointing out those gun ports. Of course, you've got multiple masts, lots of sails, incredibly complex rigging system. This vessel could fight anywhere, on any ocean around the world, could easily travel around the world. So this is the result of the military revolution. You start with this medieval cog, single sail, not very big, rivers and coasts, and then, by, 1650, 1700, this is what you're looking at. It's an incredible, that, constitutes incredible change in naval technology. The final step of the military revolution is arguably what makes it matter so much. If the military changes that happened in Europe in the early modern era, whatever they were and wherever they were, if it was just about military change, then military historians would care, but people beyond the confines of military history probably wouldn't invest themselves too much in it. But what makes the military revolution debate so important for anybody that does early modern history, for anybody that does military history, is that it absolutely had an enormous impact on the medieval world and early modern world beyond the confines of military affairs. Excuse me, I've already referenced this previously, but we have to talk about this because this is what makes it such a big deal. And it's these political and social and economic and cultural changes that feed back into the military revolution. So the first thing that we know is that, as we talked about, feudalism was breaking down in the late medieval period. And this is because lords were starting to care less about what their kings wanted them to do. So remember, in the feudal relationship, a lord gives a vassal land to run and administer for him. But the underlying assumption of any feudal system is that actually everything belongs to the king. At the top of the hierarchy, all the land actually belongs to the king. The king's just basically lending out his land for his loyal vassals to administer and defend for him. But the underlying assumption is always that all of it actually belongs to the king. And that's a really good assumption initially, but after 10 generations of family living on one, one county or living in one parcel of land controlled by a lord, now they start to think of the land as theirs. And over time, there's more there's more vassals that exist, more lords, more counts, more dukes, pick your title, just more vassals, they control more land, and kings get weaker and weaker and weaker, and lords get stronger and stronger and stronger, until you have a country like France, where by 1400, the French king literally controlled a territory smaller than England. The rest of France was controlled by really powerful feudal lords who, pay lip service to the king, but didn't really actually have to do anything he wanted them to do if they didn't want to do it. So kings have to find a way to fix this. And what they do is they come up with granting town charters. So remember I talked about in the High Middle Ages, trade was really, really good. So trade's really active in the High Middle Ages. People have a lot of interest in trade. And the place that trade takes place is cities. So if you want trade to increase, and you want to increase the amount of trade that's, taking place, you build cities, because cities are centers of commerce. And in kingdoms, the only person that can give a city the right to exist is a king. So what kings start to do is they start to grant charters, which are basically just contracts that say, you have a right to exist, city. So kings start to grant charters for cities, because they now can directly control the cities, because they're the ones that have to issue the charter. And they get tax revenue for it. So kings grant charters to cities. Cities are centers of commerce. Commerce is really good. Cities become wealthy. Kings can tax the wealthy cities, and thus kings become richer. So this is really important, because one of the reasons that kings want more money is because they need to wage war. And they'd have to be able to pay for war, because all of this stuff, the ships, the cannon, the muskets, the soldiers, all of that costs a lot of money, and they have to have a way to pay for it. So one way to pay for it, grant town charters, get lots of taxes, new sources of revenue that they can put back into their armies. There also emerged a new banking system. So in the medieval period, if a king wanted to go on campaign, usually a king took out huge loans from some type of international trading company. So companies did exist in the medieval period. International corporations is sort of what we would call them. And most of them were what we call super companies, or that's what historians call them. And most of them were based in Italy or Flanders, and they traded things like grain and wool, so, raw goods. And they made lots of money doing it. So if kings wanted to go on campaign and they needed a lot of cash to do it, they'd take out loans from these super companies. But in the medieval period, they didn't really have any type of advanced banking systems that existed. So kings would take out these loans, and they were just sort of expected to pay them back in like big lump sums. And there were many times when kings failed to do this and bankrupted super companies. So I talked about 1346. In the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the first campaign where we have cannon on the battlefield, and the Siege of Calais in 3647, which is the first time we see cannon used in a siege. Remember that? Talked about that. Well, Edward III, the King of England, who was in charge of that campaign, took out a huge loan, £200,000, which was a lot of money at the time, from an Italian super company, and he couldn't pay it back, so he bankrupted the company. And that happened quite a lot in the medieval period, because they didn't really have sophisticated banking systems that really helped manage loans in this way. But because into the early modern period, kings need money to wage war, they're going to war more, and they have to pay for all of this stuff they're waging war with, the manpower, the cannons, the fortresses, the muskets, all that costs a lot of money. So they have to have a way to pay for it. And so the Dutch are the ones that actually crack the code first, is they invent this more modern, what we would recognize as more modern banking system, where they give somebody a loan, and the person paying back the loan pays the loan on installments, and they pay on the principal and the interest. So the bank charges interest on the loan, and when you pay back on the loan, part of your payment is the principal and part of your payment is the interest. Very similar sort of the proto version of modern day banking, and the Dutch are the first to come up with it, and then everybody else starts to adopt it. And a big reason they do this is because the people taking out the biggest loans are kings, and they're doing this to wage war. Okay? And because banks are making money on the deal, they start to invest more, and they start to create markets. So it's also no coincidence that the first stock market was a Dutch stock market for tulips, actually. And this leads to an early modern, what we call a market revolution. The other reason that this impacts states is because feudal vassals, these vassals that had become so powerful in the medieval period, they don't have enough resources to take out these loans to pay for all this stuff. Because remember, yet again, I have to emphasize, the soldiers, the weapons, the handheld gunpowder weapons, the artillery, making the gunpowder, hiring the infantry soldiers, building the sailing ships that are getting bigger, putting swivel guns on the sailing ships. At first, the only people that can afford this are kings, because they're the only ones that can take out loans that are big enough, or star forts. Building star forts was incredibly expensive. And the only ones that can afford this are rulers, are kings. They're the only ones that can take out loans big enough and then actually pay those loans back to build all of this stuff, to fuel with money, pay for the military revolution. So what this leads to is, as all these military changes are taking place, the only people that have the best soldiers and the best weapons and the best military technology and the best fortresses are these kings. So these kings that had been marginalized in the medieval period and didn't have a lot of literal power actually start to gather back their power. States start to centralize, and they start to become more powerful again in the early modern period, because they're the only ones that can afford to sort of keep up with the Joneses in terms of military change. And they use this to re-centralize their countries. And so it's no coincidence that by the time you get to the end of the military revolutionary era, this is when you have the rise of what we call absolutist monarchies, incredibly powerful, incredibly centralized monarchies that control a lot of territory, or at least very centralized states, right? The British had a parliament, but power was still very centralized at the center, not at the margins. And so states use this increased taxation, they use these new banking methods because they want to wage war, to continue to wage war, and adopt all of these technologies that are being developed during the military revolution, and they use all of that to centralize their states. States also centralize and become more organized. Because states have to find a way, they want to wage war, they take out these loans to administer these big militaries, to administer these increasingly powerful states. They need a bureaucracy to do it. So the governments also start to get bigger. So not only do central governments become more powerful and more centralized, but the governments themselves also become more complex and they become more intricate, which means you need administrators to run all of this. This leads to what's sometimes called an administrative revolution, because you start to see the bigger inclusion in government of more what we would call middle class or upper middle class people, so not from the noble class. Kings deliberately, and actually Queen Elizabeth was notorious for doing this. Queen Elizabeth I in England was notorious for doing this, avoiding the aristocracy and deliberately elevating members of, again, sort of this high merchant class, which was sort of their version of a middle class, into positions of power in government. Because remember, central rulers want to take authority away from those vassals that had, snatched power away from them in the medieval period. So you don't want to give them power in your government. You want to elevate these middle class people who don't have the power or the money to overthrow you. And so that's what you see in the early modern era, is the emergence of this sort of this bigger, more literate, better educated, more politically enfranchised, sort of originally proto-middle class, but by the end of the early modern era, it really is starting to resemble what we would recognize more as a middle class, in big part, because governments need administrations to run these big militaries, to oversee all of this tax revenue, to organize these big states. And so, literacy is increasing, administrative complexity is increasing, the amount of paperwork is increasing. And again, this leads to, the increased enfranchisement and empowerment and wealth of this and formation really, of this newly emerging, quote unquote, middle class. Something that also contributes to this too is you start to have the elevation of sort of your peasant class, because they're now paid soldiers who can make soldiering a job, which paid not great, but certainly better than sort of like a hard labor agricultural job. And, that helps elevate the lower classes as well. You finally have, a lot of the demand for bigger ships, for warfare and commerce feed into increasingly global reach of Europeans, increasing global trade of Europeans, and which feeds back into the economic stability of Europe. And that's the key thing to understand, is that the argument of the military revolution is that at its core, the demand to go to war and wage war more efficiently and wage war more frequently leads to the development of technologies and tactics and structures that cost a lot of money and take a lot of administration, and take a lot of administrative organization to run. And that's what feeds into all of this. And then it's a feedback loop. They want to wage war, so they develop better technology to do it, which takes more money and takes more organization, which means you need a more organized banking system, which means you need a more organized administration, which, and then you wage war, which helps the state centralize, and it's a feedback loop. It's a feedback loop. So, this is why a lot of people say that step 5, this is what makes the military revolution so significant and so important, again, beyond the confines of just pedantic discussions between military historians about a better musket or a better piece of artillery, is that these military changes lead to monumental cultural, social, economic, and political change throughout Europe. So it is my argument, and certainly the argument of most of your reading, that the military revolution did occur. But there are historians that argue it didn't. So I just want to summarize really quickly most of the main arguments against the existence of a military revolution. Medievalists in particular, medieval military historians in particular, argue that the military revolution's sort of underlying claim is that the medieval period was a period of stagnation before this period of great change in the early modern era. But that's not quite right. People who support the idea of a military revolution don't argue that nothing happened in the medieval period and then suddenly all of this stuff happened in the early modern era. That's certainly not what they argue. It's not an issue of no change and then change. It's an issue of slow change versus incredibly rapid change. So to use something I mentioned earlier, it's not an issue of velocity, it's an issue of acceleration, right? It's not that change never happened in the medieval period, it's just that it was slow, it was incremental, and then you enter this period of incredibly rapid change during the military revolutionary era. Another gripe people have, referring back to something we mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, is that people debate the definition of a revolution. Military change did occur, they say, but was it revolutionary? Maybe that's the problem for a lot of people, is that it just doesn't, in their minds, fit the definition of a revolution. And depending upon how you define a revolution, that might be fair. If you're talking about a, political military revolution, like the American Revolution or the French Revolution, those were less than 10 years. Certainly a very finite events happen within, easily within natural living memory. So if that's your only acceptable use of the term of revolution, then certainly the military revolution would not constitute a revolution. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, we use that term quite a lot to refer to much longer movements. If you're talking scientific revolution, that's several hundred years. If you're talking about industrial revolution, that's roughly 120 years total, with 60 years of each of its parts, depending on how you define it. Or you go really broad to the Neolithic revolution, which, as I said, is several thousand years. So certainly it is a justifiable argument from a certain point of view that the military revolution is not a revolution, but it all falls to how you choose to define revolution. But then, of course, you have to apply that across the board. Historians can't agree, so some detractors say, exactly when the revolution took place or what developments or events were part of it. And that's certainly true in some ways. Some people put the military revolution between 1400 and 1600. Of course, it's our core definition in this class. The main period of the revolution was 1450 to 1650. There's a chapter in the book that you're reading this week by Geoffrey Parker, the edited volume edited by Cliff Rogers. The chapters you're reading are by Geoffrey Parker, but one of the other chapters is by a historian named Jeremy Black. You're not going to have to read his chapter, but Jeremy Black argues that the military revolution happened in the late 17 and 1800s, so there's certainly some debate about exactly when it happened. There's also debate about what was part of it. As I said, were the star forts part of it? What about gunpowder weapons? Because if you look at gunpowder weapons, they're in Europe as late as the 1290s. There's certainly slow gunpowder development in the 1300s, so that's purportedly before the military revolution. If you think the infantry revolution was part of the military revolution, well, then you have to extend it back to 1300, because the infantry revolution happened, mostly in the 1300s. So there's that. So certainly historians debate aspects of it, when it started, when it ended, and that certainly can arguably be a strike against it. But I think it really depends on, whether you accept the fact that you're dealing with slow change versus fast change, that you enter a period where change is accelerating, not existing where it hadn't existed before, but rather a period when change is accelerating. Some people argue that these changes don't constitute a military revolution, in the sense that it should be called, a commercial revolution or a political revolution, that then in turn impacted military affairs, not the other way around. Because remember, sort of a core conceit of the military revolution is that it was a demand to go to war and wage war effectively that fed all of this other stuff. Okay? So some people say, well, no, it didn't actually start with war. It started with politics, or it started with economics, or it started with, cultural, social issues, and those things fed into military affairs. And, that goes back to what constitutes part of the military revolution, what caused it, and that type of thing. But that's certainly an argument against it. But there are a lot of people that quibble about aspects of it. And certainly there are some that still stick to the idea pretty militantly that there was no military revolution. But the fact is that the field writ large accepts that something happened in the early modern era. What exactly it was and when exactly it was is a matter for debate. But something did happen. And whatever it was that happened, we call that the military revolution. And to some historians now, this is just sort of a buzzword, that it's not meant to be taken literally, that it was actually military affairs and a revolution of military affairs, that it was just this era that we now just call the military revolution because that's what we call it. But it is certainly my conceit that it was a military revolution. Your reading is going to explain more about why this era could be considered a military revolution. And again, most historians do agree that the military revolution was something that did occur. And finally, it might be entirely reasonable for you to ask why we're learning about this. Why spend time talking about this historiographical and historical debate between historians? What's the relevance of it? Well, the reason that we're talking about it, for one, it's one of the most important debates in military history, and our course is a military history course from 500 to 1650, and this is one of the most important historical and historiographical debates about something that happened during that period of time. So certainly discussing it is important. That's actually why the class ends in 1650. That's why the department dates it that way, is because the military revolution is said to have ended around 1650s. That's no coincidence. Actually, that's exactly why. The other reason to discuss it is because it's important to understand that when you study history at an advanced level, that debates are both historical and historiographical. Debates are about what happened and when it happened and, the exact specific, things that contributed to events happening or contributed to people being who they were or outcomes being what they were. But another big part of history is motivation and, causation. Why things happened the way they did. What were the most important factors that made something happen the way it did? And that's a really big part of history that you've actually been doing all semester. When you read these monographs by these different authors that talk about warfare in these areas, when we talk about, the interaction between these cultures, why cultures rose and fell the way they did, why some methods succeeded and why some methods didn't, that's historiographical discussion. So you've actually been doing it all semester, especially when you talk about comparing and contrasting different cultures. So of course in your discussions you've been doing a lot of talking about comparing and contrasting different methods of warfare and then finding underlying similarities. That's a historiographical thing to discuss. So perhaps without realizing it, you've actually already been doing it all semester. And this is just an example of the most important historiographical debate in the field of military history. From a historical perspective, and again, the class ends in 1650 for a reason, is that from a historical perspective, the military revolution is responsible for the fact that by 1650, European militaries were the most tactically and strategically capable and technologically advanced in the world. So, by 1650, because of these military changes, and because these military changes affected politics, and economics, and society, and culture, Europeans were able to create the most tactically and strategically capable and the most technologically advanced militaries in the world. And it is with these advanced militaries that Europeans establish their global empires, which you will learn more about if you take the second half of this course about warfare from 1650 to 1914. So I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of the military revolution. Of course, you're going to read more about it with your selected readings this week. If you have any questions, just drop us an email and let us know. And as always, have a good week.